I'm Smaran. I'm a graduate student with Daniela in comparative literature at NYU, and I've sort of on and off, but pretty consistently since 2016, been working with Uli as a research assistant. And so early in the pandemic, Uli kind of floated this idea by me of this project that he was thinking of working on, and I just thought it was a great idea. And we've spent a lot of 2020 assembling this book, conceptualizing it, writing it, and it's an anthology. So like we haven't written all, I don't know how many pages of the book. They're compiled text, but this has sort of been like our pandemic research project. And yeah, but maybe let me just say a few things about myself. I am originally from India. This might be something that is also worth talking about. Like Uli was born in Germany, in Berlin. I was born in Bombay, and then we're publishing this anthology of American fiction. But that's maybe something to talk about. But yeah, I'm from India. I studied in Germany. I have a background in American studies, American literature, and here at NYU, my PhD project is on Afrofuturist fiction. So I'm writing about Octavia Butler and Samuel Delaney. But what really, so maybe first a few words about the book itself, right? The book is, it's an anthology of early American fiction. It goes from, I want to say from the first text that we have, in fact, is not dated. It was transcribed in 1816, but it's the Iroquois creation myth, so it goes from there to the early 20th century. But the first published date that we have is 1612. And so basically what we've done with this book is compile a number of different early American texts on the basis of firstness or primacy. So who was the first American poet? What was the first American novel? Who was the first African-American playwright? We basically spent, months doing this research, bringing these texts together, and we really think that it gives us a different glimpse onto American history through American literary history, and it kind of gives you a different picture to the one that you get not only say through high school curricula, but also in the university classroom. The way in which American literature has been taught has been much more along the lines of these great white male authors, but using this lens of the first, you get to see a very different picture of what American literary history has actually been and how there's been a diversity of voices from the start. But maybe I'll let Lisa.
Maybe I'll jump right in. So what Smaran said, we were really interested to use this category of the first published text. So the first Native American poet, the first African American poet, the first Arab American novel, the first Asian American to publish anything in this country. And what we found remarkable, first of all, that you couldn't just type those categories in and Wikipedia would spit out the results. That actually it took an enormous amount of research to establish what is the first published text by a person in a certain kind of category. We thought this was important, and we really relied on the research of amazing people who have been scholars, academics, but also community activists, people who worked on their own community literatures, who actually try to restore a kind of suppressed history that goes much longer and much deeper into America's past than was assumed by some people, maybe. So we include texts that are included in some anthologies, but mostly in specialized publications or grouped in categories that don't spell out American literature. So I came into this because I was teaching, and I teach a lot at NYU, a lot of undergraduate courses, and I was looking for short stories to teach, and I found the short stories by Senfar, who is an Asian American writer who wrote in the 1890s and 1900s, British Canadian Chinese, and who identifies deliberately as Chinese American, as an Asian American, although she could have technically passed for white in the terminology of that time. And instead she said, I'm going to write fiction in addition to journalism about Asian Americans in America. These are texts that give you the whole texture of that experience at that time. And my students were totally electrified when they read these. They said, whoa, we didn't know that Asian American literature goes back 130 years in this country. We actually thought it starts and originated at another point much later, post-war in the 60s. And then people like Frank Chin in the 1960s and 70s started anthologizing Asian American literature. And you have Maxine Hong Kingston, Amy Tan, people who become very well known. But there's a much earlier history. So this book gives you a much better understanding of the 19th century. And then the other part, I thought, for me, this is a book of the true history of free speech in America. And I mean this in the following sense. Jupiter Hammond, who was an enslaved African-American man, today we call him African-American, who lived on Long Island on an estate for 95 years. He was enslaved by white Americans on Long Island, close to New York City, and then in New Haven. And he published poems in his lifetime when the government, Congress, the courts, and white society did not even recognize him as a full human being. So he wrote against all of these obstacles. And I was really interested in all these debates we have in America of who belongs and what history is and what's free speech. There's always this kind of tenor, we must defend free speech for the people we really hate. And I thought, these people, Jupiter Hammond, that is truly free speech in the American someone who spoke against every possible obstacle and published literature. So many people in this book weren't really recognized in any way. Women were not allowed to go to school past 4th grade, couldn't enter universities, couldn't own property, couldn't publish anything. So they had to find a way. So Smaran and I thought, this is historically just incredible to imagine people who lived under conditions that are really unimaginable and yet spoke on their own behalf. So, and then we should talk about some of the texts. They are so exciting to me and so thrilling. And every text that Smaran and I refine, we would do an entire research project and try to discover as much as we could. And as we said, there's so many people who've done enormous and amazing work. And the correctives that have happened. I have here this is the American Tradition in Literature, Norton Anthology. This is the first Norton Anthology in the 1950s, which gets republished until the 1970s. It has one woman author and one person who wrote a diary, no non-white authors. And it goes from the beginning of literature to Lincoln. And this was shaping America's self-understanding for 45 years. And then we have amazing progress, let's say, and incredible work. Henry Louis Gates publishes the Anthology of African American Literature, but I'll stop with this example. So this is a Norton Anthology now. It's the Bible for English and American literature. It's fantastic, it's wonderful. And what the Norton Anthology does is great. It includes all these diverse voices in the language of today. And then it puts them into categories. So Native Americans, removal and resistance. Slavery, race, and the making of American literature. And you have 5 texts. Not one of them is a literary work. They're all political speeches. So Smaran and I thought, oh, so if you are not a white author, your task is to do politics and sociology in an anthology of literature, but they won't give you space to include your poetry. So we kind of thought this strange hierarchy that actually you think, oh, political speech, Martin Delany, who Smaran should talk about because it's really a work he knows really well. They're including an essay, The Political Destiny of the Colored Race on the American Continent, but they don't include his fiction. So in some ways, the American imagination is kind of given over to white authors, mostly, and male authors. And political work, it feels like those people who are not white or men have to do the political work to justify why they're even in the canon. And the other one just included with the play. So maybe Smaran, I'll give it back to you. So Martin Delany is kind of a good point because it's your work, your research.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not specifically writing on Martin Delany,
right.
But here's the novel that we excerpt. It's Blake or the Hearts of America, and it's the first sort of utopian African American text, and it was never completed. The last two, I believe it was the last 2 chapters were lost, but but his political speech, as you say, is included in the Norton Anthology, but not this like incredible novel that describes global slave revolt, right? Like that is just the amazing early, in fact, not just African American, but like American utopian text. Why isn't this anthologized? Why don't we know about it? And it's not just Martin Delany, right? It's so many of the authors we came across, and Yeah, and there was an additional aspect, I think, to compiling the anthology was to think about, yeah, there's aesthetic quality, there's sort of this, there's the political perspective, the political point that we're trying to make about, how people from different backgrounds within America were writing literature, but it wasn't just that they were writing literature, they were writing good literature, right? Like these texts need to be appreciated for their aesthetic quality as well. And so that played a big role in how we decided to include these texts in the anthology.
Yeah, with this question that you just identified, we kind of stepped into the kind of culture wars that have been going on since the 90s. And sometimes people say to me, oh, Uli, the culture wars, the canon debates, Alan Bloom, that's so 1990s. And I said, oh, really? So the last 4 years were not a major culture war in America, where for 4 years we've had an administration who tried to impose a specific interpretation of America's past on America, who's had a great interest in intervening in curriculum. The 1619 Project by the New York Times and the pushback against that is actually pushback against the school curriculum and a different interpretation. So we thought this should become available to people for the reason that Smaran said, these are literary texts that ought to be studied and read and recognized on their own terms, because they shift your image of what American literature is. If you know Whitman and you don't know John Rowland Ridge, you don't know American poetry, really. And there's a kind of steady diet of Whitman and Melville and Dickinson, and Edgar Allan Poe gets cut out. He's only for high school students. He's not for college students. There are these weird decisions that are being made. And I found some of these texts. So Jane Johnston Schoolcraft is the first Native American poet to publish poems. Samson Occom before at Dartmouth writes sermons, so it's considered maybe scriptural writing. And she has a poem called The Contrast, which starts out sounding like an American take on what Wordsworth would have done in England. And it says, with pen in hand, I shall contrast the present moments with the past. And the poem goes on. She talks about where she grew up, and she grew up as the daughter of an Indian chief in today's Michigan. And she marries a white man who's responsible for managing the entire Indian territory in what's today kind of the Midwest. So in her own house, she's married to the white man who's ultimately going to subjugate her tribal sovereignty and her tribe to the federal government. So on her father's side, she comes from the Native American side, and in her family, she's married to the white man who's actually going to administer all these new rules. And then she publishes this poem, and the last two lines of the poem, which are really remarkable, says, and half in joy, half in fear, welcome the proud republic here. And for students, or for me, this is an amazing poem to read through by a woman who's 25 years old at the time in the 1820s in Michigan, who's married to a white man, but her father is a well-respected, important chief in her tribal community. And she's talking half in joy and half in fear. What is the American project? To bring Native Americans into the Republic, also expel them, expropriate them. So there's a tension, and this poem gives you an entry into this without assigning immediately sort of a story to that. So we thought these poems and these plays open up a space from which to think from the perspective and in the voice of somebody who was deeply affected by this. For me, this was just kind of a way to get into these issues that are continuing to haunt America. And then honestly, I mean, Smaran and I, we've been working together for years on different projects, and, doing last summer and doing the kind of reckoning prompted by the Black Lives Matter protests, they really prompted a lot of my students to ask more pointed questions of saying, what is America? What does it mean to me? And how do I see myself reflected in this? And as a university professor, I feel a great responsibility to address this in a serious way. And maybe Smaran or Daniela, I'm actually really interested in this kind of demand that representation matters. And some of these stories and these texts we put in this anthology, some of my students, as I said, were electrified. They said, oh my God, I can see something that matters to me. And I thought, well, I'm sure you have been assigned those texts before. And I said, to be honest with you, I have not in high school and not at NYU. And so I thought, we got together, we wanted to make this book available. We published it as inexpensively as we could. It's $19. The ebook is $9. We wanted this to be for high school teachers, for people who want to read, who want to learn this, who can't afford, and with all due respect to Norton, this anthology, I think costs $89 or something like that, or you can rent it for $27 for one semester. This anthology, the Heath anthology, very progressive and diverse, amazing. I think it's $90. And so that for me is a consideration. Where's knowledge actually then kept and who has access to it?
No, absolutely. And maybe just to pick up on your comments about culture war, how these lines get drawn between either you're sort of too political and you want to throw the cannon out, or on the other hand, you're part of this camp that's trying to protect, conserve this bastion of old culture. And I guess in our conversations that led up to the book, one thing that became very clear to us is that this is a false opposition. This is simply a false opposition. There's a lot of a big part of sort of America's literary heritage that's simply ignored is diverse. So it's not that we're trying to replace the canon with a few recent texts. Often the term presentism is thrown around, or you're just interested in the present. And sort of like, if you want to read, authors of color, you only want to read texts from the 90s onwards or whatever, 60s onwards. And that's false, right? There's this long history. And so we should really think about how these lines just don't make sense. This opposition just doesn't make sense. Of course, there's sort of like right-wing political interest behind the one side of the like culture wars claims. But yeah, there's simply something that shouldn't be ignored.
The hard thing is the debate of the culture wars is not even so clear that there's right-wing and then sort of progressive or liberal, because in the middle is the category you identified, sort of aesthetic merit, or these texts are just good. And let's be honest, someone decides that they're good. I mean, they speak from the mountaintop in their prophetic wisdom. They are inherently good. Walt Whitman is inherently good. Walt Whitman self-published his poems, solicited reviews, printed Emerson's favorable review. Emerson was outraged and said, I didn't give you an endorsement, I gave you a private letter. Emily Dickinson got 8 of her poems published in school newspapers and elsewhere out of the 1,700 or 800 she published. So you have authors in the American canon who no one recognized, nobody knew, and someone decided in a way to make them important. That's the work of reading. So we thought at least these texts should be available. So if you want to decide that someone matters more than others, but as Smaran said, it's not a zero-sum game. We're going to swap out Melville and put in John Rawlins Ridge, or we're going to take out Edgar Allan Poe's poetry and put instead Jane Johnston Schoolcraft. It's not an either or, but it's a deeper understanding. And I always thought, aren't the conservative the ones who want to have a deeper, more kind of academic understanding of history, not one driven by identity politics? And I said, well, here's your book. This is a book of published authors, so you should study this book and read the entire book and tell me what you think is not right about putting all these people into the canon, rather than starting at the other side and saying, oh, this is all identity politics. You're just putting a bunch of non-white authors back into the Norton Anthology. That's not that project. So Daniela, I feel like you have a question.
Oh, no, I was just going to suggest that maybe I share my screen with the table of contents.
Sure.
Just so that people have a sense, because I know that when I was sort of reading about the book, I thought, well, how did you make these decisions? Like how,
right.
like how do you make this selection? Because I've also worked on editorially on anthologies before, and also I think I would be very scared to put someone down as the first and then find out that there was actually someone who came before them.
You should say something about that. We did spend a lot of every anthology, as you know, is a matter of decisions. But maybe you should say something about how we came up with these versus others.
No, I mean, so each of because each of the entries that we've included is in a certain way a claim, right? We're saying this is the first text in a particular category, and we aren't just coming up with this. Like a lot of grunt work, a lot of effort went into doing the research to establish each of these texts first. So in almost all the cases, I mean, we included in the bibliography at the back, we're relying on already published scholarship to make these claims, right? So there's other people who've, I mean, maybe I don't know if this is true in each and every case, but in most cases, there's other people who've already established these texts first. So the decision, so we already have this productive constraint, but we still had to make the decision of which first to include. And that was something that was in our hands. And that's something that, sort of aligned with this sort of overall broader project that Uli's been describing. But were there any, sorry, Uli, go ahead.
Well, it's these two categories. First, as Smaran said, we relied on other people's research tremendously, but we'd read a lot of full-length book about actually even establishing the first published woman playwright. It was really complicated, and it's really to the credit of an enormous amount of, I would say, self-identified feminist literary historians who actually worked in the 70s and 80s and 90s to correct an understanding that women did not publish anything. So they found these texts, but then there were disputes. Was this published? Was it published under her name? Where was it published? Does it count as a publication if it was in a limited journal or something like that? So those are technical questions. But the second question you raised, we did sort of start out by saying, okay, let's assume there's an assumption of American citizenship. And let's also note that American citizenship was not granted the rights or responsibility citizenship to many, many people in America until after the Civil War, and then the voting rights until much later for women. So in some ways, there are certain big categories of people who were just not considered full Americans. We know that. African Americans, Native Americans, anybody, sort of certain types of immigrants and women. We made a decision, we won't include non-English texts. There's an amazing multilingual anthology of American literature edited by Mark Schell and Werner Salers, who includes non-English language texts. We couldn't do a book of 2,000 pages. But we thought these categories that everybody understands, I'm saying everybody understands who operates in good faith, that Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, Arab Americans, that those categories were not included in the generic understanding of mainstream publishing of what is an American citizen. So we started scanning for those and then discovered lots of things. I mean, the first African-American play, which was produced in 1822 on Bleecker Street in Mercer, which is behind me, and where NYU is now building a huge building. And I hope they're going to acknowledge that the first African-American professional theater company was there for 3 years until it was shut down by a riot of white people who didn't want Black theater in 1822. And that play is unfortunately lost, but the next play that comes out in the 1850s has been performed once at Columbia University and is not really recognized or known, and it's an amazing play. So we thought we will use this lens of seeing, okay, who participates in imagining America outside of the legal categories.
And there's maybe one more point to add to yours, Uli, which is that these categories are anachronistic, right? So the identities, especially when it comes to things like sexuality, did not exist at the time in which these authors were writing. So we, when we were trying to establish, say, what the first, lesbian text of lesbian American literature was, it required, and there too, maybe this was another area in which we had to make a certain call. It required either, because we had two options. We could either go with Gertrude Stein, who's the first person to use the label lesbian writer to describe herself, or we could go with what we found were the first, and which some scholars describe as the first lesbian themed literature. And so we went with the latter, right? And so maybe the point I'm trying to make is that a lot of these identity categories are anachronistic, but no less valid, right? They emerged later, but they still describe experiences that very much did exist and were legally, say in the case of like queerness, were legally sanctioned,
That's right. And these people would not have understood themselves in the way we would understand them today. So Maria Amparo Ruiz de Burton, who is really considered the first novel in English by a Mexican-American author, she would not understand the terms Latinx, Latina, Mexican-American, Chicana. None of those categories existed, but she has been considered the kind of sort of grandmother or the kind of origin of a Latinx literature today. Sui Senfar is considered a key figure in Asian American literature. She wouldn't have understood the idea of Asian American identity, which is a label that becomes used in the 1960s in the Berkeley student protest movement, where Asian American is starting to become a political identity. So there's a retrospective kind of problem that we're imposing. And then I put Rose Terry Cook, My Visitation, which is an amazing story about this love affair between two women. And then the one woman kind of breaks up with the other one. And then the spurned lover is now unfit for marriage because she's experienced this tremendous passion. And what's heterosexual marriage going to give her? Just boredom and tedium. And we wrote to all these amazing literary scholars who wrote back and were very gracious and explained that this is a great project. We love this, but we will not make this decision for you. You have to make this decision and live with it, because this may not be the first lesbian themed story. There are many other ones about super intense female friendships, and female friendship is a category that then feminist critics went back and said, what are we describing here? Where does it shade into something that has its own significance outside of friendship? We put Walt Whitman in here, and the Calamus poems, which are widely recognized today to be considered gay-themed poems. As we know, Whitman took pains to kind of dissociate himself every so often from being in the language of the time didn't even exist. A homosexual, we don't know, gay, queer, none of these terms existed. But Whitman kind of played with that and kind of benefited from the notoriety that everybody knew, but no one talked about it. I've asked Whitman biographers who hesitate to identify him as queer. I said, were you in Emerson's bedroom at some point and really established that he was heterosexual? Like, there's no one has any problem defining all the other authors as straight. But when someone is a little bit queer, you're like, we need proof of this. I'm like, what is proof here? Like, this is the poem. The proof is in the poem. And the story I want you to talk about, Smaran, also because it's just such an incredible story. It's the first African-American short story, Teresa, a Haitian tale about the Haitian Revolution in 1828, which was published anonymously. It's just an incredible story. And I think for people who are interested in history, this is a story that everybody, I think, should read.
Sure, I'll go to that. I want to add one quick thing about us making the call as to each of these texts being the first in their category, right? So one of the things that came up in our conversations while putting this book together was, we actually want the book to become the book of seconds. So we want people out there, to go and do even more research, right, to prove us wrong, right? And I think we're willing to update the book in a future edition. And but this was sort of our effort at bringing together these texts to the best of our knowledge and to the best of the scholarship that we came across were first in that category, right? But if we're able to find an even earlier text of, say, Mexican-American literature, an even earlier, lesbian-themed story, we would love to hear about it, right? So yeah, we want this book to go from being the book of first to being the book of seconds.
And let me add one thing, an example of this. So Jupiter Hammond, who I mentioned earlier, who lived on Long Island in New Haven, 1786, publishes a poem that was discovered in 2015. And it's been published only once in a specialized journal, the amazing, Journal of Early American Literature. So it's been published once. It was discovered by Cedric May and Julie McCown, who are both scholars of African American literature. So a poem was discovered in 2015. It's one of the first published poems by an African American man, because it was in the wrong box in his owner's estate, filed in the wrong way, because he doesn't have an entry in an archive, because he was actually owned by these people. But of course, people like Cedric May have now reestablished Jupiter Hammond as an important American writer. So what Smaran is saying, there may be discoveries. Someone may actually find an extant play in some archive where it was mislabeled. And also we should acknowledge that the history of archiving and preserving and tabulating these things didn't include many of these people. Women's writing or writing by minority writers wasn't classified in the same way. So we would be excited if someone wrote to us and said, you're wrong, there's an earlier text.
And so in the case of Jupiter Hammond, he gets sort of lost in the shadow of his enslaver. But in the case of, we have a very similar case with Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, which I believe the Native American literature scholar Robert Dale Parker also only discovered her poems or found her poems in an archive in the early 2000s while going through the papers of her father, I believe, right?
Her husband.
Was it her husband, right? In the state archives of Illinois in Springfield. And the reason her poems were sort of tucked away in these boring, relevant, if you're a political, historian of that particular period, but like these sort of like boring demographics, papers on demographics and other sort of bureaucratic documents. The reason they were tucked in there was that when the archivists came across these papers, they just did not deem the poetry of the daughter of this the wife of this administrator to be worthy of attention as literature. So It's only now in the early 2000s that Robert Dale Parker, comes across them and says, this is important. People should be reading this poetry. And that's maybe one more point about Jane Johnston Schoolcraft. All the texts in here are English, except for Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, whose poetry was, she wrote poetry in both Ojibwe and English. So we print both the Ojibwe and the English in the book.
Like
but about to read,
a similar case to the story you're going to talk about by S. So Frances Smith Foster, who is an American literary critic, a scholar, an African-American woman, she actually wrote a lot about this story. And in a way, in the 1980s and 90s, when it was written as a kind of specialized own African-American text. And we want to say, so that really what we're also saying, we're acknowledging the work of all these people who worked for so long to get these stories to even be read for the first time. And what some of them did, so they researched African-American newspapers or general newspapers that published occasionally a Native American poem, but somehow people who created the canon, so with all due respect to people who did the Norton Anthology, they sort of looked at what had already been sort of published and anthologized in major works. So there had to be another kind of different kind of research to find all these texts. But this Haitian tale, it's just an incredible strange story, and it's also super teachable, and you can read it before you go to bed. It's very short. Probably 14 pages.
A lot of the texts that we've excerpted here are pretty they're excerpts, they're digestible. And so we have talked about the book as like not this sort of, mammoth thing that you have to read cover to cover. It's no Middlemarch, it's no George Eliot, but you can read each of the bits separately. But just what you were saying about, finding this literature in, say in African-American newspapers, this story, Teresa, was published in Freedom's Journal, right, which was a Black paper at the time. And the author is anonymous. The author is only identified by S, but the assumption on the basis of sort of the theme of the story is that the author was a Black woman. And so this is so important because the first fictional text, the first African-American fictional text was written by a Black woman, and it's about the Haitian Revolution. And like the political import of that should not be lost on us, right? And not only that, but it's about how a Black woman, a teenage priestess, or prophetess, I guess, is how you can describe her, changes the course of the Haitian Revolution in the favor of the revolutionaries, right? So she brings a prophecy to Toussaint Louverture. It's in so many ways like such an amazing text, and I think it's criminal that like a lot of these texts aren't taught in general American literature classrooms, classes.
Yeah. And I totally agree. I think this would be a text also. It would serve two purposes. It would let you understand, okay, a Black teenager changes world history by helping Toussaint Louverture find out where the French troops are going to go. It's just kind of super funny and also super important. And I kind of want Casey Lemons, who is the director who made Harriet and Eve's Bayou, I want her to pick up that story and turn it into a movie, because this will allow a lot of people to see, oh, so history isn't just made by white men in power. We know that history has been revised, the history curriculum. And the second thing is important about this, it'll excite students and readers about literature, that there's a force in literature that it actually tells the sort of lives of people in an authentic way that isn't just, it can't be summarized. There was a question by somebody who said, how did we pick the criteria for Excerpt? Because of course there are novels in here, there are plays, we couldn't include all of it, or poems. Some of it is we just try to read a lot. So we would just read a lot of poems, as many as we could. Some of the work is pretty voluminous, so you read a lot of poems and you try to find a few things that represent the voice and the range of interests. So James Johnson School, or Anne Bradstreet, the first American published poet, she writes poems to her unborn children. She writes poems after the loss of her children, and she writes an incredible moving poem about upon the burning of our house. They lose their home in 1666. And to be honest with you, I also thought during the pandemic of people going through so much suffering and difficulty, there's a line in this poem, there's wealth enough, I need no more. At the end of the poem, she's lost her entire house and she walks past this charred, burned, desolate plot and sees the remnants of her stove and of her table. It's gone. And there's a woman who turns that into a poem. And I find the power of literature to sort of convey this kind of loss or trauma was one. And then the other one, we relied on other people. We consulted with experts who were incredibly gracious. And we'd say, look, we want to excerpt 2 chapters from this novel. Which one do you think would set enough of the tone? And the second part is, what would allow you as a reader to get the novel? So sometimes we use maybe the first chapter, and then a very dramatic chapter in the middle where something happened, where someone's identity is exposed or something major happens, or there's a very dramatic escape or something like that, where we thought it's by plot. So you're not totally lost saying, wait, I have no idea who these people are, what's happening. We wanted all these pieces to stand on their own so you could read it and say, okay, I get kind of what's at stake here. We put in Cecil Dream, Theodore Winthrop, who was the son of the president of Yale, illustrious, American promising young man who was one of the first casualties in the Civil War. He goes to war, signs up, and dies right away. And then they rush 4 of his novels into print right away in 1861. So he's one of the first people to die in the Civil War, and he's very illustrious, white, big American family. And his novel is hilariously queer in today's world. It takes place in Washington, around Washington Square in the Village, and there's a chapter where they go to the opera and they talk about people, and it's sort of Edith Wharton, like through Andy Warhol and in the club scene or something like that. It is so funny and strange, and we picked that chapter because it really gets you into the book and its atmosphere and what it does, which you think couldn't have been possible in 1861. You think, okay, maybe 1961, maybe 1981, but 1861. So the selection criteria is sort of where these, what can make sense to a reader who's stumbling into an anthology. And we made a decision, Smaran, not to have a book of 1,000 pages for reasons that seem obvious to me, but maybe some, and there's a way maybe one could put this all online and create a 1,000-page anthology, but I don't think that's really productive.
No, and I think what's difficult about a 1,000-page anthology is that it ends up being this sort of intimidating book. You feel like you have to read all of it in order to fully understand, say, American literature. But and even those 1,000 pages would leave out so much, right? Just as the Norton Anthology does. But maybe just an extra word about Cecil Dream. It even offers a sort of longer history to thinking of, Greenwich Village as this queer space, because we associate it, Greenwich Village, Washington Square, Stonewall, right? 1960s, 1970s is when that space comes to be marked as this queer space. No, in 1861, we have this novel about a gay man and his sort of adventures across the village and across the city. And we hesitated to, describe it as the first trans-American novel as well. One of our colleagues, Uli's colleagues at NYU, Lisa Dugan, does this in her blurb of an edition that was published recently. But the protagonist falls in love with basically a trans woman, right, who wouldn't at the time be identified in those terms in his historical period.
We were cautious at that point. We were cautious to not overstate our claims to kind of appropriate a work into a tradition that maybe does really need to recognize it's very different. So we sort of said, we understand why Lisa Dugan said it's a first trans novel. We thought those categories are really important to keep apart. There's cross-dressing, and then there's identity. So we thought, let's leave this here. And then what we want to let people decide who read it. It's not for us to put a label on, to slap a label on it and say, this is now that text. People should read it. And this is, I think, the force and the excitement of literary text, that you can actually take this text and say, this part actually foreshadows an entire political, sociological, psychological trend that takes much longer to unfold. We have this text, Suzette Laflèche in Shadatumba, who is...
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt you. Just before you go forward and we leave Cecil's Dream behind, I think the reason we chose to label it as the first queer novel is precisely because there is this fluidity around both sexuality and gender.
Right.
Just to add that, yeah. Otherwise, we could just call it the first gay novel, but it's not just that, right? And that's also another thing that's interesting, that queerness has this much longer literary history.
And then the other thing that Smaran and I talked about a lot, that the identities that we use today, as we know, are very intersectional and complex, and they were very complex back then. So John Rawlins Ridge comes from a family of Native Americans who owned slaves. So there's a very complicated kind of affiliation and no simple ways of saying this fits here and this is there. So what we also wanted to say, it opens up and invites people to do more research and say, this is actually complex and interesting. William Wells Brown, who writes the first extant play called The Escape, A Leap for Freedom, he wrote this play to read out at public events where he spoke to thousands of people. For me, this is kind of unimaginable and also really exciting to think he and other people like Frederick Douglass, they would speak to thousands of people and he would recite and act out all the characters in his play. And it was so popular that he finally wrote down the play. And the play is really complicated because it's about loyalty and betrayal, and it's a love story of this couple, and they're owned by two different families, and they make their break for freedom to go to Canada because they can't get married. And the woman is being abused by her enslaver, and the man is going to be punished. And then there's another enslaved person who kind of betrays them but turned around. And it's very complex because you can, from the beginning of the play, decide, oh, they fit into this category, they fit into that category. They all make decisions. And that's why we thought a literary text is very important, because they make human, complicated, difficult decisions under difficult circumstances, but they're not entirely defined by those circumstances. They actually break out of those circumstances. There's a scene in this play where a white man goes into this kind of bar, restaurant, I think it's in Buffalo, upstate New York, close to the Canadian border. And he says something like, well, but you can't really sort of enslave people and all this. And then the Constitution, and then the people say, the Constitution is what we make it mean. Shut up, and you can't say these. And he's like, wait, isn't there freedom of speech and the constitutional rights? And they said, no, we define what it means for everybody else. We are white Americans. And I thought, wow, okay, this is 1858, and there's a white American telling another white American the Constitution is only what benefits us who are in power. But that, okay, 150 years later, those debates don't seem so far from us. But when you see them in this play, so we thought the excitement was to open up these kind of categories through these works. I don't know, I could obviously go on. Obviously, I find them all super exciting, these texts.
Uli, you were going to say something about Suzette Laflèche.
Suzette Laflèche, so in Shadatumba, who's a Native American author, becomes a major translator and visits the White House and people and things like that. And she writes this short story, Nadawi, an Indian story from real life. It's a children's story. and published in a very popular magazine. And it's a very moving story, and it's very interesting. And I'm quite interested in this story because often we dismiss children's literature or young adult literature as not serious, not relevant. And she basically chronicles the day of this young girl who's maybe 12 and has to take care of her baby brother. And everybody else gets to play or go around, or the boys go hunting. And then at night, she kind of loses the brother for a few minutes. Panic ensues. He's the baby brother. Then he returns. And then she's brought back into the community. And then her father gives her a lesson of what it means to take care of somebody. And then this other boy kind of teases. It's really an amazing microcosm of how someone is centered in their little family as a 12-year-old girl, then centered into their community, in the tribe, in the tribal relationship to the land, in the government. So it unfolds an entire set of questions from a very moving and relatable story. And I thought this was a remarkable tale that was quite popular and has been more or less forgotten, except for the many people who work on indigenous literature or Native American literature. And, yet again, we have to give credit to them. And we found this relatively late. We were sort of thinking, there was a lot of late night messages where like, shit, Smaran, I think we found another one. And Smaran was like, no, this one is like the first category of this. I'm like, I don't know, let's do this. And then it would take a week of research because you think you type it into Google and it shows up. You can reverse engineer this book now and type in every story and you'll almost find first so-and-so. But it took us sometimes. And a week in pandemic times feels like a long time because there wasn't much else to do. So we would be up till 2, 3 in the morning thinking, okay, is this really the first Native American, novel published? And then he's like, no, I think this is right here. Look at this. And then you'd have to go, and thank God for the library systems. We have access to NYU, so we could look at digital collections of books. I mean, we actually did the work. We went to every single original publication to verify spelling, punctuation, and publication history, which was amazing that you can access newspapers from 150 years ago.
Were most of the texts originally published in newspapers?
Short stories, yes. Books, novels, all published by publishers. Poems published in newspapers largely. And then some of them published their own anthology. So George Moses Horton, the first African-American to publish a book in the American South, after Phyllis Wheatley, who was the first African-American to publish a book of poetry before the United States, from the United States. So she's an enslaved girl in Boston and publishes. But George Moses Horton then published his own books to make money for himself and never made enough money to buy his own freedom. And so there's something very poignant and moving and also kind of horrifying that this man is an accomplished poet. He started writing poems for college students, their love letters. He was so good at it that people would pay him a little bit to write a poem for their girlfriend or boyfriend, mostly girlfriend, probably is mostly male students. But then he publishes books that are actually recognized, they get reviewed. He's the bard from Carolina, but he doesn't make enough money with these sales. So as we know, poetry sells less. So stories, I think, in newspapers or journals, and the rest in their own publications.
Yeah, I think it was the novels that were largely published as novels, whether they were self-published or with a publisher, and then the others that were published in newspapers. I wanted to maybe touch on on Yone Noguchi, right, and the incredible sort of the first Japanese author to publish a book of poems in America, right? And the interesting case about Yone Noguchi, was that we also had to sort of like walk this fine line between saying, okay, this person spent time in America. Does it? At what point do we describe them as Japanese American or as Japanese? And in the case of Yone Noguchi, I think we said, so this is the first Japanese author to publish poetry. And what's fascinating is that the haiku form is now so widespread, right? In the US, it's all over social media. Just as a poetic form, it's had such a wide impact. But if you think about it, it was, to the best of our knowledge, best of my knowledge, it was a Japanese author that introduces it into the English language, into American literature. And so maybe I could read a couple of stanzas from what we excerpt from Yone Noguchi's Japanese hokus. I mean, that was just how it was transcribed at the time. So he writes, what is life? A voice, a thought, a light on the dark, low, crow in the sky. Sudden pain of earth, I hear in the fallen leaf, life's autumn, I cry. The silence, leaves from life, older than dream or pain. Are they my passing ghost? Is it not the cry of a rose to be saved? Oh, how could I, when I, in fact, am the rose? But the march to life, break song, to sing the new song, clouds leap, flowers bloom. And so, I mean, I'm just going to stop there, but it's just what you're hearing or what you read, what you're going to read is, some of the first haikus in the English language and in America.
And ask an English undergraduate, when does haiku or tanka, when do these forms, haiku, start in America? And they would say Ezra Pound. And Noguchi wrote a kind of challenge or invitation to Ezra Pound and said, you should study Japanese form. Noguchi is the one who brings that into American literature. Then he writes to Yeats and says, you should study no drama. So the intercultural exchange, that we put him in this book, and as Smaran said, like, it looks like, oh, it's so innocuous. We said first Japanese poem. We really wrestled with his identification. We didn't know whether to call him Asian American, Japanese American. He stays in America for a long time, then he goes back to Japan. So we didn't quite know. We didn't want to make an error of attribution here. We really wanted to acknowledge, but he is someone who completely alters the shape and sound of American and English language poetry. And he's not someone, to be honest, I didn't know. And there's a part of it also, like people said to me, well, Uli, that's your problem and on me. And it is on me. And I went to very fine schools and I studied a lot of American literature. And I didn't know some of these authors, the Asian American contingent in our book, which is just amazing, which is kind of interesting also because you can see the historical sort of shifting in America's demographic. Carl Sadakichi Hartman, Sui Senfar, Yoni Noguchi, Winifred Eaton, or Onoto Watana, Yoni Noguchi, they're all arriving in the 1890s and right till 1920s. So suddenly you have 5 voices, incredibly popular books, who are shifting something. There's a craze, there's a kind of Orientalist craze, Madame Butterfly, etc., the Gilbert and Sullivan musicals, all of this. But they're actually trying to shift that to say there's a more authentic way of writing in an Asian American idiom. And we think this is something that's worth studying. And, you know, I teach at NYU, you both are at NYU. I have a great number of Asian American students who really don't generally feel that they are included in how America speaks about itself in the tradition of literature. So for them to see, look, these people originate an entire tradition that every high school student in America has been asked to write a haiku. It's a common exercise you do as an English teacher. And what Smaran just read, this is the sort of the history of American literature. And I wouldn't say, oh, it's the outside, it's somewhere else. This is American literature inside of America. And then the last entry in the book is Amin Riani, whose novel, The Book of Khalid, 1911, is the first Arab-American novel about these 2 Lebanese young guys who immigrate to America and arrive Statue of Liberty. They come to New York, they work in the tenements, they become political activists, and then they go back to Lebanon, bringing back their insane American ideas and become revolutionaries. It's an incredibly funny, amazing, strange book that was republished, which is really important. And we thought, oh, so the Arab American presence starts in Lower Manhattan in 1911 in literature. And these 2 guys, you should follow them. It's a great novel. And we were so excited to see this is something, to be honest, I'd never heard about. I did not know this existed. I didn't know these books existed. And so it opens up a different way of thinking of where America ends up.
And I think that's the personal dimension of this project is how, despite being trained in American literature, I mean, both Uli and I, and not knowing a lot of these texts even existed, it's sort of like, you almost feel like a slight has been done against you, you know, like, right. What is this narrative of American literature that was passed on to us? I have a master's in American studies and I've never heard of Amin Rihani. And there's some, I never mentioned, right? And so there's something that's deeply wrong about that. Maybe we could, not to preempt anything you were gonna say, Daniela, but maybe if that's cool with you, we could circle back to the biographical question, because I think it's not irrelevant that we're both
that's where I was going.
non-Americans putting together this project.
Yeah, smart. That's where I was going. And I was just going to add that I was looking through it, and I noticed that there's no German American or Indian American entries. So,
right.
You know, which seems actually quite arbitrary, right? Because it's not like there aren't German immigrants to.
There were quite a few.
Right. But you know, not to say that that's an oversight. I mean, that's another question I have is like, are there, this is a follow-up, but like, are there texts that you wanted to include that you didn't end up including, and if there are sort of stories around that? But yeah, I mean, I do think it's very interesting that, you know, neither of you is from here, right? And why was it so important to you to make, you know, a book about America as such, right? And one that is sort of paradoxical in as much as it's sort of trying to push against binaries and categories, while also sort of reifying, right? While also kind of holding them up and saying, okay, this is a new kind of canon, right? It's like the conversation around canon, which is sort of like never ending and sort of unproductive. But yeah, so I mean, I think questions around that are very interesting, if you guys could speak to that.
So maybe I'll let Uli take the second part of the question. But when it comes to, yeah, maybe before going to our biographies, just a quick point about the first German American and the first Indian American literature. I think maybe another sort of category of literature that we didn't end up including is like maybe some of the first Jewish American writing. But when it comes to the Indian American, when it comes to sort of Indian American literature, it's you can kind of see the waves of immigration to the US in the chronology of American literature. And so the first Indian American novel was published, I believe, in 1964. And what's fascinating is it's also the same year in which the first Pakistani American novel is published. So both are in sort of in the 60s. And that's when the, you know, from with the Immigration Act later in the 60s, that's when there's much more immigration from South Asia. With German American, and I'll let Uli answer this maybe, but I think just the category of whiteness as it sort of adapts over time, I think comes to include Germans fairly easily, right? Even though, as we know, around the founding of the United States as a political project, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, there were like, Germans were described very briefly as like non-white, as falling outside very briefly as outside of the sort of WASP category of as swarthy or something in one of the founders' like political texts. I forget which one, but so there was that very brief moment where like whiteness gets defined very sort of narrowly as almost like you know, Anglo-Saxon, but then very quickly German immigrants are very much part of white America, and so I think that for me would be the rationale not to necessarily include, since it's part of the mainstream canon, right? But yeah, sorry, Uli.
Yeah, I think that's what you're saying, Smaran. It's, of course, we use sort of today's lens and today's category in a way to identify sort of the biographical dimension. And we really wanted to think about the people who had not been recognized as mainstream American writing, plus the people who were actually legally, politically kept from publishing and speaking. So I was really interested always in this. I always, as I said, I'm really interested in this kind of dimension of free speech in America as a bedrock principle. And I said, well, these people exercised it from the beginning, so they should be the ones celebrated. I always find this kind of, I don't want people to sort of say, oh, we must defend the Klan. No, we must defend these people who spoke on their behalf. And then the second thing, there are books. So the anthology I mentioned, the multilingual anthology of American literature by Buenos Salers and Mark Schell, which includes texts in Arabic, Italian, Lenape, French, Spanish, German, really amazing and remarkable book. And it's a 500 or 600 page book. It's right here. This is the book right here. So it's massive. And I felt we had this. So that's one thing. And then sort of Daniela, to your question, who we are, I think there's a kind of, to be honest, and I really don't articulate this probably as sort of so much, so there's a slight self-consciousness in me probably. I mean, I went to college in America, I went to graduate school in America, I went to high school for a year in America, and I'm a very proud American citizen, a naturalized citizen. And I actually don't just bristle, but it actually upsets and depresses me when people say, you're not really American. And it happens a lot. And they say, you're not really American. And it happens from liberals, from my colleagues. I was introduced at a panel 2 weeks ago and said, well, you're not really an American, so can you say something? And I said, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. But that's the same logic that Trump and Stephen Miller used, that there are people who are really American and some people who are not quite so American. And this entire book is composed of people who were not considered quite American. Not American enough. They're Native American, they're Arab, they have all these identities, but they weren't American enough. So I think there's a part of me where I thought this decision, who's really American, which to be honest, is mostly wielded by white Americans who came here at some point who were not native to this continent. So there's a kind of confusion that I always find like, okay, that's the first confusion. So we thought this book should come from the place of, this is America. It's called Fictions of America. This is America, which is the openness of people like Smaran and me coming into the place. And to be honest with you, we had someone who said to us, we love this project, but we can't really write a blurb out of 40 people who are very gracious to blurb this book. And someone said, because I don't know if it's really solid enough because you guys are not Americanists. Smaran is an Americanist. He has a degree in American studies. I am not. Two. So you make up for one that I don't have. I don't have one, but I kind of thought, okay, I read a lot. I sort of try to think. And then the other thing is, Daniela, this book didn't exist. And I only publish books because like I want this book to be teaching from. I want to assign this book to my general education literary class. And I teach a lot of students at NYU who are majoring in computer science, data science, business, and economics. That's their majors. They do not major in Comp Lit. They do not major in German, English, or anything like that. They read these texts because they think, oh my God, my requirement, I have to do it. It's senior year. I'm going to do it with this dude, and it's going to be literary text. And I signed these texts, and my students were like this. And I thought, I want this book. So part of the reasons we did it is because we didn't ask anybody for permission. We just said, he has 2 degrees in American studies, and no one else did the book. So I'm sorry, if someone else at Norton Anthology had done the book, God bless them, but they didn't. So that's my motivation, was to get it out there.
It needed to exist. And so, indie press, just the work of like 2 scholars through the pandemic, but it needed to exist, and now it exists. And like now it can be criticized, and maybe people can like offer suggestions, it can get better, but it needed to exist, and it exists.
And the great thing is, like, we really have to say, I mean, we're so grateful that all these people in the front, they really lent sort of time. They read through the entire book. We got endorsements of people saying, which was really moving. They said, yeah, I knew a bunch of these, but I didn't know this. So a lot of them are experts. They said, oh yeah, of course I know this. I'm a specialist in African-American literature. I'm a specialist in 19th century fiction. I'm a specialist in the novel, in women's writing. But this is new. And we loved producing a book that is a book of discovery. Sort of you found, wow, actually didn't think of this. And, maybe the part of it, I don't know, Smaran, I like this about America. There's a kind of, this country is characterized by kind of a spirit of innovation, a spirit of experimentation. I've always thought this is the greatest part of America. And this is a book in that spirit. All these people who wrote, they just didn't wait for anybody to say, would you like to write a book of poetry? Phyllis Wheatley is 18 years old in Boston. She is enslaved by a doctor's family, and she starts writing poems. She didn't wait for anybody to say, would you like to publish a book?
No, and I think this ties back to some of the other work that we've done together on free speech, as you said, which is that the First Amendment gets misunderstood as this enabling thing that allows people to enact, their speech. But that's historically has not been the case. The most sort of audacious expressions of free speech and of literary expression have happened against the law, right? And weren't enabled by it.
Right. But Daniela, does that make sense to you in a way? It's kind of interesting because we kind of like don't spend as much time probably theorizing ourselves.
No, I mean, I think that's great, and I think that's probably one of the advantages of the anthology, right? Is that it's not. I mean, you know, would you say that the introductions that come with each entry are sort of how would you characterize those introductions? Do you give, I mean, and the introduction to the book as well? Is there like a do you kind of dip a toe in the sort of more theoretical framing of what you're doing, or do you purposefully kind of try to make it more accessible by just saying, look, here's a list of texts, we invite you to read them and to add to them and to critique them, but you know, read them with a sort of minimal amount of historical and maybe political context?
Maybe I'll start. Yes, we aimed for accessibility. I mean, we would have liked to write a 50-page introduction. That would be an academic paper, but we limited it to 5. We stress that literature aims not just for factual truth, but the authenticity in the telling. That's a major conviction that drives this book, that the authenticity in the telling supersedes maybe the factual information conveyed. And secondly, I probably have been thinking about this question of what qualifies a strong literary text for 40 years. And I think in some weird way between Smaran and I, because we go back and forth and we edit these sentences and then we say, how about this, how about that? It's really fun to actually work with somebody. So, I mean, like, to me, it's like a joy to work with someone so smart, because then I have a sentence and he's like, well, that's not quite the sentence. Let's push this in a different direction. But I think it's informed from both of us having done so much theoretical work. And in some ways, I was really trained in literary theory. I mean, I was very, very fortunate. I studied with Shoshana Feldman, Jeffrey Hartman, Jean-François Lyotard, and Jacques Derrida. These people who are just brilliant philosophical minds, but they always centered something on literature as a distinct form of expression. So in some ways, we didn't have any theoretical discussions in here. No, we're not sort of using terminology that people can't access or not in the university. And the one-page intros were always balanced between saying, here's the author, this is the significance of this, and here's this text. And we were able to, I think, pack in very little space sometimes in a page and a half, something saying this challenges an entire conception of what the novel can do. So we kind of open up in these one-page introductions, something for people to say, I'm not a literary scholar, but that's interesting. So maybe, Smaran, you can add something to this.
Yeah, no, I mean, if the majority of, like, say, the theoretical work that we do, or the, you know, conceptualizing the book happens in the introduction. Yeah, and as Uli said, like, we really tried to keep the biography pages sort of about the author, you know, introducing a sort of the introduction to each text as sort of a mix between biography, talking about the text a little bit, maybe a little bit about the context, and sort of the contribution that they're making, but not going into either, you know, the mass of literary debates or theoretical debates about each of these texts or about their historical context, even though we read those as we were writing these introductions. So yeah, just to reinforce what Uli said, like, this is a lot of how we did the book was shaped by the audiences that we had in mind. And so it's not, we weren't aiming this only for, you know, for our professor colleagues in the university. But I think even they, as like the blurbs have shown, even they were pretty excited by it. So,
right. The dedication is right here for our students. Who are really some of the most engaged and smartest people that I meet, who are 19 years old or 20 years old. And there are sentences in the introduction that probably contain an entire bibliography of theory behind it, because we make certain claims for what this book is. And these claims are not just we throwing them out. We're saying this is a more truthful account of who we have been and are and will be as Americans. In that sentence is an entire understanding of what is history writing, what is historiography, what is literary history, all this. So but as Smaran said, we didn't want to then footnote and say the culture wars, starting with Thomas Jefferson's dismissal of Phyllis Wheatley because African-American poetry should really not deserve commentary. So the ambivalence is telling in Thomas Jefferson bothering to write about this poet who comes to his attention in order to dismiss her. And as a reader who's been trained, I can read that and say, so Jefferson seems to be somewhat ambivalent here because he has to take time out of his busy schedule to trash somebody who said shouldn't really be recognized as a poet of the highest order. So what is it in her poetry that makes him pay attention? She wrote to Washington and he responded and replied. So in some ways that opens up so much. So we didn't want to have a theory heavy, like, I don't have anything against theory. I love theory. But it takes a long time to assimilate theory into a language that people, I think, follow. And not everybody has a luxury to read, every canon debate and every kind of complicated argument.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, especially for just those of us who are trying to teach just as a pedagogical tool, right? It seems incredibly helpful. I feel like these are the kinds of collections that come in really handy for especially like young teachers, educators who are just getting started and like trying to figure out what to put on the curriculum,
Exactly.
Instead of reading the same stuff that you've sort of been handed down, to kind of look at a fresh page. I had one question from before, which was, which maybe is also betrays my training too, but America, right, as a word or as a concept, right,
yeah,
is well, so it's a geographical marker, right. And I was just, and I don't think I'm going to ask what you think I'm going to ask, but I was just wondering if you think that sort of from reading the selection that you've made, that you get a sense also of the place, like the territory, because, well, also you're talking about North America essentially, right? You're talking about sort of, and I mean, it seems like not even Canada, right? It's really just the sort of United States as such now.
Right.
And it's sort of from, it seems like, the earliest text is like 1816 to 1911-ish. So it's about a century. Is that accurate?
1650 and Bradstreet.
Oh,
1816 is the first transcribed Native American creation myth. So we use that because it's transcribed by a Native American author. So we wanted to have not a white author.
Right.
But then it goes back to your question. It's America. We realized the problem with the word America because it's a kind of sort of, it doesn't really capture what we wanted to do. So we felt the kind of bounded United States as we know them today. There's a lot of sense of place in this book, of people making sense of where they are.
Yeah,
whether it is
my question, really. I just want to hear about that. It's not a critique.
Yeah. No, it's totally great because it actually is this whole idea that people are on this continent and make sense of where they are physically located. So Jane Johnson Schoolcraft returns from England and sees the pine trees who are native to her region of the world, Michigan. It's very important and moving to her to see these trees. She writes a whole poem to this tree. It's not a romantic little poem about a tree. It is a poem about her coming from a land, having been taken, going to England. John Rowland Ridge writes this incredibly moving poem, An Indian's Grave, where he comes around a mound that people are just walking over, and he realizes here's an Indian buried. And he says, how do we mourn this dead who has nobody to remember him by? And he says, the white man's plow will not disturb the red man's resting ground. So he kind of steers his white troops around this to preserve a kind of sacred place. So there are places, and then there's Sui Senfar's story in the Land of the Free, which is deeply moving and deeply sort of sad, of a Chinese American couple, and the woman arrives in San Francisco, and they take her baby away from her at the border and seize the baby and put the child in custody because they don't have the right papers for her. And it's about arriving. She describes the hills around San Francisco Bay, coming through the Golden Gate Bridge and describing what she sees. This is her land. So it's very much actually a meditation on what it means to be in America. It's quite like the leap to freedom is they're making their way from the Carolinas to the Canadian border. That trek is really decisive. But Smaran, do you want to jump in? Like this is
no, just maybe I think you've covered this really well about the how the place of place in this literature, right? So whether it's the pine trees or New York, I really do think like place comes through in a lot of these texts. But just a really quick word about, because I know that Daniela, you work on sort of Latin American literature as well, right? And so the question of using the term America. So what we do say in the introduction is, the text gathered here are first only in relation to the particular political entity called the United States. But and then we also say we're not referring to a sort of state-sanctioned project of literature, like these are the official whatever poet laureates, but there has been, over time, this kind of accretion of this idea of America as like a cultural notion that's shared amongst a lot of people. So what were all these different writers who thought they were writing as part of this cultural project, which, overlaps with the political entity? What were they doing? And so, of course, the Americas are the Americas, and it is a problem when the United States, this has actually been a discussion on Twitter recently, but that the United States comes to stand in so often for America, as if there was only, as if the United States was all of the Americas, right? And there's also like indigenous names for the Americas, Abya or Turtle Island. But so we're basically referring to the US, but as the cultural side of this, shared imaginary. And how it's been, unfortunately, incorrectly racialized as this kind of,
That's
white
actually
male canon.
I mean, we also, the title, we wanted to be kind of bold and put this title out there, partly because what Daniela, you said, if you're setting up a curriculum and you're teaching high school English in 11th grade, or you're teaching a writing course in a community college, or you're at a research university, English literature, a senior seminar, this should be a reference. And then we have these little biographical sketches. And then we have in the back a list of further readings. So there's always a paragraph to say, these are the scholars who've done this work. So if you're a teacher, you want to know more, it's in the book itself. So we've saved a lot of people, I think, a lot of time to say, oh, I want to discover this little tale, a Haitian tale, but Teresa, I don't know anything about it. Who's written about it? So we refer Professor Daub, who's written on the Haitian Revolution. And so there's a kind of reference part. The second thing I wanted to add, the word first is a really problematic word, because while it's something we celebrate, Kamala Harris is the first in so many categories. That also means she is kind of testament to a history of exclusion that has been unjust. So every first in this book also has an entire huge legion of writers behind them, around them, who we can't find, who were never published, who were never anthologized, who don't exist anymore, who were just silent and who don't exist in a historical record, but have to be acknowledged. So first is a really ambivalent distinction. You're the first of something that means there were so many people who couldn't get there because of arbitrary and unjust rules, not because you're the first great poet. There were countless novels published in America at this time, and why did it take so long to get a Native American or Mexican American novel out? So both. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to jump in to say there's also been a history of using first as a way to erase indigenous past, right? So sort of in New England, we came across an excellent study that talked about how in New England, the sort of renaming of places and sort of claiming that this was the first settlement in an area was a way to erase, sort of an indigenous presence that preceded it. And so again, that's another problem of first. And there's lost texts. There was texts that were never anthologized, never published, that most certainly existed. And then also, say, oral traditions which weren't passed down in a textual form, which we don't have access to, right? There are other ways of having access to it through oral history, through ethnography. But that was another constraint that we placed on this book. We're going to look at texts, like written texts.
Yeah, right. I was thinking about that as well, just sort of who has the tool of writing, right? Who gets to learn how to write in English, and let alone have it be published, right? So that all those individual histories of each text and each person is just kind of like blows your mind, right? To think about what they had to get through in order for their text to end up in this book. you know. And
yeah, there's a part of the work of being an editor, I think, for Smaran and me. I mean, you know, we didn't discover them in an archive, but there is a way to put them out there, put them in the covers of a book. It's also honoring and acknowledging people whose work has really otherwise been lost, and it gets lost, and things get lost continually, and especially writings by women and non-white authors. They actually get dropped from the canon. They stay in specialized curricula or classes. You find them in the class on this subject, but they don't survive. And there's a weird kind of inertia in the tradition that it keeps on churning out the same things over and over, and then people just say, "Oh, let me just grab the Whitman because it's something I heard. It's really important to know." And yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say. I mean, I know we have like a minute or so. I mean, we can go over for a couple of minutes, but just that, you know, it just brings us also to the press, to Warbler Press. I wonder if you could just say a few words about it, because you know, sort of more macro scale, you know, these texts are lost, these people are lost to us, and then it takes a critic or an editor or a publisher, right, to find them and have the power and the means, the resources, right, to publish them or to somehow recirculate them. So maybe you could just say a few words about that, and we'll close.
I mean, part of it is we really, like Smaran and I talked about this, there was an option to publish it with a very major academic publisher, actually the biggest in the world, so people can figure out who that is. So that was wonderful and exciting, and it would have been a very expensive book, and it would have taken, I think it was, if it was fast tracked, it would have taken 10 months to get it published. And then there was the immediate caveat, well, anthologies are hard to advertise, they don't get reviewed. And when I heard all this, and I've published with very distinguished presses, I'm very proud of, I have MIT, Random House, like books out there, which is fantastic. But they're still living in an old world where you need to get reviews by 4 major publications called the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal. That is not the world that my students live in anymore, and that most high school teachers can't live in because it's too expensive, because these books are then, I mean, I think Obama's memoir is $45 to buy. It's a $45 hardback. That's wonderful that it sells 2 million copies, but I just am not convinced that this is really the mode to deliver actually really important knowledge. So we thought we'll go with a small press. It's going to be on us. It's a lot of work to get the word out there, to get it to be known. And at the same time, I am the one part where I'm old-fashioned. I would like some of my students to purchase this book and have it as a reference, and actually go home and say, look, mom or whatever, someone you're dating, saying, look, this is an amazing story I found in college in a class. You can read it. And they could buy it because it was $20 versus $69, which is just unaffordable for most students. So we thought small, nimble, fast. And the other part is, Smaran and I, we wanted to get this book out in Trump's America, like literally. And this culture war is not over. It is not over. Even if Amanda Gorman read at the inauguration, it does not mean that now half of America has changed their minds that, yeah, you're right, we should actually read these texts. So we wanted it to be out, available. It's available on indie books. And that was more important than waiting for the big imprimatur of sort of saying, oh, this is published by this major publisher.
And you didn't want to put it, you wanted it to be a book, a physical book, not online.
Yeah, it's both. I mean, there's an ebook version of it, but as you've probably both experienced in teaching, students are sort of 2 minds. Students do everything electronically. During the pandemic, we do most of our lives electronically, but then my students tend to print out things they have to read and annotate, and even if they're short texts. So we kind of thought, there's still an advantage. I know this from my own kids. I have 2 teenagers, so my daughter is still a high school senior. She actually reads physical books. And she said she has to sort of focus, turn off her phone, read for 30 minutes to get through her book. She cannot just be on the screen. So I think there's some part, and the other part, Smaran, I mean, you should say something about this. Like, as I said, this is a tribute to all these people, all these authors who actually cared greatly about being published in 1812 or 1911. So we thought we'll want to republish them.
I think there's also a question of distribution, right? We want this to be in physical indie bookshops, across the country, so that people that are, I mean, there's a lot of older people that who are not reading ebooks, and it's not just an age thing, right? Like I find it really hard, as is evident, to read
Right.
ebooks, but I think there's a real advantage to having it as a physical copy in bookshops. And for people to be able to purchase it. And similarly for schools, a school is not necessarily going to assign an online PDF that's floating around, right? That's maybe distributed on the merit of, Uli's name as a professor and this random grad student in New York. I think for it to be distributed as a book, for it to have gone through an editorial process, even if it's an indie publisher, the editor who basically runs Warbler Press, Mary Baer, it was just she used to work with Harper, I believe, and is just a fantastic editor, knows how the industry works. And choosing to publish with her and with Warbler was also a bit of a political decision of like, we want to support this indie publishing landscape.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Great answer. Thank you. We also want to support the indie publishing landscape and book selling landscape. Thank you both so much. This was lovely. I just dropped the link for the book that you can get through Word Up's site, Fictions of America, the Book of Firsts. Thank you all for coming, for attending. This was recorded. Yeah, thanks, Smaran. Nice, very nice. It's a very pretty book as well, which is always nice. And we look forward to seeing you at future Word Up events. Check out our website. I'll just put it in the chat again for all kinds of updates. Take care, everybody. Please stay safe and warm. And we hope to see you in person again sometime soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. Okay.
Thank you.